My name is Serena Blake, and for as long as I can remember, the world tried to make me small. In my own home, I was the forgotten one, the daughter they wished would simply fade into the wallpaper, disappear without leaving a mark. But the truth about shadows is this: when the light finally hits, they stretch farther than anyone ever expects. They wanted me silent, erased, invisible. Instead, I found a way to shine so bright that even the ones who once overlooked me had no choice but to see me. This is my story. From the very beginning, I was treated like a ghost in my own home. My parents had a way of making me feel as though I wasn't even there. My words fell into silence, my presence dissolved into the background, and any small achievement I tried to hold up was brushed aside like it carried no meaning. I remember clutching my report card at 13, glowing with the pride of a top score, only to have it crumpled and tossed into a drawer without a glance. Every smile I wore was answered with a smirk, every effort reduced to not good enough. They laughed at me across dinner tables while I sat quietly, holding my breath as though the very sound of my existence was an inconvenience. I learned to live in the spaces no one cared to look, behind half-closed doors, in corners where the lights never reached. I became an expert in silence, in watching people without being seen, and listening for the cracks between their words. At night, I'd sketch little pictures of skylines in the margins of old notebooks, imagining myself somewhere far beyond those suffocating walls. My family thought they had convinced me I was useless, that I would wither under their neglect. But secretly, I was nurturing sparks inside me, sparks I refused to let them snuff out. There is something about being ignored that hardens you. When love is withheld, you begin to build your own armor, piece by piece, from every sharp word and every cold glance. I remember overhearing my parents once, my mother saying she wished I were more like the others, my father shrugging, calling me a disappointment. Those words branded me, not with shame, but with a strange fire I didn't yet understand. If I was nothing in their eyes, then I would become everything in my own. Still, those years were filled with small humiliations that cut deeper than they seemed. I would enter a room and conversations would stop, not because I commanded respect, but because I wasn't worth acknowledging. Birthdays passed without celebration, while my siblings basked in praise. I would try to join in, to laugh with them, only to be met with rolled eyes or silence that screamed louder than words. It wasn't just neglect, it was a deliberate attempt to erase me, to make me believe I had no place even within my own blood. But in that erasure, I found space to imagine. I began keeping secrets, small at first, like hiding a book I loved so they wouldn't tear it apart, or sneaking into the library to read late into the evening. Those secrets became my survival. At 15, I made a choice that would quietly change everything. I slipped an envelope beneath the floorboard of my room. Inside were scribbles of my dreams, a list of goals, and the first dollars I had earned tutoring a younger neighbor in math. It was my hidden rebellion, proof that I was building something they could not see. That envelope became more than paper and coins. It became my lifeline, my reminder that I was not powerless. Every night when the walls of my house seemed to close in on me, I thought of that envelope. I thought of escape, of building a life where my name mattered. My family wished I would disappear, but I was already planning the day I would return, not as their invisible child, but as someone who shined so bright they would never again be able to look away. Chapter 2 turns back the clock, pulling the audience into Isabella Graves' childhood, where the roots of her exclusion were first planted. She recalls how she grew up in a house full of noise, but the sound rarely included her. Birthdays became moments of quiet shame, her cakes smaller, her gifts cheaper, her presence often overlooked as her sister basked in attention. She speaks of family dinners where laughter filled the table, but her words were brushed aside like unimportant whispers. Teachers at school praised her achievements, yet at home, those victories were dismissed as accidents or luck, never enough to earn her parents' pride. The visuals paint her memories vividly: an empty seat left at a recital, a photograph of her sister front and center, while Isabella is pushed to the far edge, half cropped out of the frame. As the chapter unfolds, Isabella shares the sting of subtle humiliations: the hand-me-down dresses, the chores piled onto her shoulders while others were free to play, the way her parents introduced her as the quiet one, when in truth they had silenced her long before she had the chance to speak. She remembers the loneliness of being present in body but absent in belonging, like a ghost haunting her own home. Yet within those shadows, a spark was forming. Her voice trembles with both pain and defiance as she reflects on how invisibility gave her sharp eyes. She learned to study people, to read between their words, and to carry secrets quietly until the right moment. The chapter ends with a shift in her tone. She admits that while she was made to feel worthless, every dismissal carved into her a determination to one day prove her family wrong. The screen fades to black as her words echo. They raised me to believe I was invisible. What they didn't realize was that shadows can grow teeth. Writing. Chapter 3 shifts into the storm of Isabella Graves' teenage years, when the years of small cuts finally bled into one unforgettable wound. She recalls a winter evening when she returned home late from school, her arms heavy with books she had borrowed for an essay she hoped might make her parents proud. Instead of praise, she found the front door locked, the lights inside warm but unreachable, her family's laughter muffled behind glass. She knocked, called, begged, but no one opened the door. The cold that night was more than weather. It was a truth, a declaration that she was never meant to be part of their world. That was the night, she admits, when the final thread tying her to them snapped. Her narration sharpens as she describes how the humiliation hardened into a vow. No tears, no pleading, just silence as she walked away from the house that had never felt like home. She worked jobs most teenagers wouldn't touch, cleaned after strangers, stacked shelves until her fingers cracked. Every dollar saved not just for survival, but as a weapon forged quietly for the future. The visuals become darker and grittier. Isabella sweeping the floor of a grocery store at midnight, a blurred shot of her staring out a bus window with the city lights reflecting in her eyes, her figure dwarfed by towering buildings that seemed to mock her smallness. She reflects on how, for the first time, the idea of escape felt not like a dream, but a necessity. Every slight, every insult became fuel. The loneliness that had once swallowed her whole began to turn into something sharper, more focused. The chapter closes with Isabella's voice low and steady, a promise etched in ice. I left with nothing, but nothing was lighter to carry than their cruelty. And with empty hands, I began building the life they swore I could never have. Writing. Chapter 4 marks the beginning of Isabella Graves' transformation from a forgotten daughter into an architect of her own destiny. She recalls how leaving home with nothing but bitterness and a thin wallet forced her to make choices most people never imagined. She took jobs that paid pennies but taught her survival, waiting tables in the early morning, cleaning offices at night, and studying business textbooks in between shifts. The exhaustion was crushing, but she learned to wear it like armor. Each sleepless night was not just sacrifice, it was strategy. She describes how she studied people, their habits, their mistakes, their greed, and began sketching a life that would no longer depend on anyone's permission. The visuals grow sharper, more determined. Isabella writing plans in the margins of old notebooks, tucking away cash into envelopes hidden in dresser drawers, her reflection staring back from a bust window with resolve hardening in her eyes. She remembers the first time she said the words out loud, whispering to herself in a dim apartment. One day, I'll own something that no one can take away from me. That promise became her compass. This chapter also reveals her first small victories, the promotion at a diner after months of relentless work, the moment she walked out of a bank clutching the approval for her very first loan, the pride of signing a lease not for survival, but for her own business venture, however modest. Each success was a brick laid carefully on a foundation she was building alone. The chapter closes with her voice steadier, edged with a spark of anticipation. She admits that revenge was never the plan at first. It was survival. But as she built, as her name began to hold weight in contracts and accounts, she realized that every step forward was bringing her closer to something far greater than independence. It was bringing her closer to the day her family would no longer look down on her, but would have to look up. The final line strikes like a drumbeat. I wasn't just surviving. I was blueprinting revenge. Writing. Chapter 5 descends into the long, grueling stretch Isabella Graves calls the silent years. A period when the world seemed deaf to her efforts, when every step forward was followed by two steps back. She recalls nights of staring at balance sheets with red numbers glaring like open wounds, of pouring coffee into her veins just to stay awake through another 18-hour day. There were ventures that collapsed before they could stand, partnerships that dissolved when promises were broken, and moments so bleak that the idea of giving up whispered constantly in her ear. Yet Isabella never surrendered. Instead, she turned her silence into a shield, keeping her plans close, her struggles hidden, and her determination burning beneath the surface. The visuals are raw and unflinching. Isabella sitting alone in a dim apartment, papers scattered around her like battlefield debris. Late-night neon lights bleeding through blinds as she types furiously at a computer. Her hands calloused from work, gripping a pen as though it were a weapon. She remembers moments when her peers mocked her for trying to rise above her station, when her family's absence felt like proof that she was destined to fail. But each insult became a nail in the coffin of their expectations, pushing her further, driving her deeper into the grind. What made these years silent, she explains, was the absence of recognition. Success was still a distant dream, and no one was watching to applaud her effort. She lived in the shadows, forgotten by the world. But within those shadows, her identity was reshaping. Her narration grows reflective here, admitting that isolation broke her in some ways, but rebuilt her in others. It stripped her of illusions, of dependency, and left behind a woman who was no longer searching for approval, but forging her own authority. As the chapter nears its end, the tone shifts. After endless failures, one deal finally landed, a contract that turned whispers of doubt into murmurs of respect. That deal became the spark that lit the fire, proof that her years of invisible struggle were not wasted, but preparing her for something far larger. The chapter closes on her words, heavy yet defiant. For years, no one heard me, but the silence wasn't empty. It was the sound of me sharpening my edge. Chapter 6 marks the turning point where Isabella Graves transforms from a survivor into a force of authority. With the contract that finally broke her silence, she began to accumulate not just money, but leverage. She recalls the intoxicating rush of signing her first major property deal. The ink from her pen, a symbol of control she had never been granted in her childhood. Each acquisition was more than business. It was reclamation, a rewriting of the narrative that had once cast her as invisible. She poured herself into learning the mechanics of real estate, contracts, negotiations, and the subtle art of turning hesitation into advantage. For the first time, people who once overlooked her began addressing her with respect, their tones shifting when they realized she had the resources to outbid, outmaneuver, and outlast them. The visuals here are sweeping and cinematic. Isabella walking through unfinished buildings, the echo of her footsteps filling empty halls, wide shots of city skylines with her name quietly typed onto contracts in glowing overlays. Close-ups of her hand tightening around a pen before she signs another deed. She recalls the thrill of seeing her name appear on property records, a permanent mark in a world that had tried so hard to erase her existence. Each purchase was both an act of independence and a piece of quiet revenge, as if she were buying the future her family said she could never touch. As her influence grew, Isabella found herself drawn to symbolic choices. She didn't just buy spaces, she bought statements. Venues where people celebrated milestones, where families gathered, where love was meant to be honored. She admits, almost with a hint of a smile, that perhaps part of her was already thinking of her family's wedding plans when she signed the deed to a glittering event hall, a property her competitors had overlooked, but she recognized as invaluable. At the time, it was just another investment. Later, it would become destiny. The chapter closes on a note of foreshadowing, her voice low and deliberate. I bought more than walls and chandeliers. I bought my way back into their lives. Chapter 7 begins with a phone ringing, a simple, ordinary sound that would soon become the thread tying Isabella's quiet empire to the family that had abandoned her. She remembers the moment vividly. She was reviewing blueprints in her office, papers spread like puzzle pieces across her desk, when the call came through. On the other end was a frantic voice from the manager of one of her newest properties, the event hall she had bought almost on instinct. The manager explained that a high-profile family had booked the space for an upcoming wedding. But complications with permits meant the final approval required the owner's signature. Isabella listened silently, her pen hovering over the page. Then, with measured calm, she asked the name of the family. The pause before the answer felt like an eternity. When the surname slipped through the receiver, her surname, it hit her with the weight of a lifetime. The family that had mocked her, cast her out, and branded her as a burden was unknowingly preparing to celebrate their grandest occasion in a hall she now controlled. She recounts the rush of emotions, anger, disbelief, and almost dark amusement. Fate, it seemed, had handed her the stage she never thought she'd step on again. The scene cuts between Isabella's narration and the unfolding irony. Her relatives touring the hall, praising the chandeliers, the acoustics, the elegance of the space, all the while oblivious that the walls belonged to the sister they had discarded. Isabella listened silently, her pen hovering over the page. Then, with measured calm, she asked the name of the family. The pause before the answer felt like an eternity. When the surname slipped through the receiver, her surname, it hit her with the weight of a lifetime. The family that had mocked her, cast her out, and branded her as a burden was unknowingly preparing to celebrate their grandest occasion in a hall she now controlled. She recounts the rush of emotions, anger, disbelief, and almost dark amusement. Fate, it seemed, had handed her the stage she never thought she'd step on again. The scene cuts between Isabella's narration and the unfolding irony. Her relatives touring the hall, praising the chandeliers, the acoustics, the elegance of the space, all the while oblivious that the walls belonged to the sister they had discarded. Isabella listened silently, her pen hovering over the page. Then, with measured calm, she asked the name of the family. The pause before the answer felt like an eternity. When the surname slipped through the receiver, her surname, it hit her with the weight of a lifetime. The family that had mocked her, cast her out, and branded her as a burden was unknowingly preparing to celebrate their grandest occasion in a hall she now controlled. Chapter 8 opens with an envelope sliding through Isabella's mail slot, cream-colored and sealed with gold trim. She picks it up absent-mindedly, expecting another contract or partnership offer, but the weight of the paper feels different. As her eyes scan the scripted lettering, her breath stills. It's a wedding invitation from her own family. The very same relatives who had once excluded her from gatherings, dismissed her existence, and celebrated milestones without her now extended a hand, not out of love, but out of necessity. The irony slices deep. Isabella recalls holding the card delicately, as if it might dissolve between her fingers. The words were polished, the details extravagant, the tone dripping with prestige. Yet nowhere on the page was there true acknowledgement of her. It was addressed not to Isabella Graves, sister, daughter, family, but to Miss Graves, venue owner. That distinction told her everything. She was no longer the forgotten girl. She was a name that carried weight in contracts, a signature they couldn't proceed without. Isabella admits that for a moment, she considered ignoring it, throwing the envelope in the trash and walking away. But she couldn't. This wasn't merely an invitation to a wedding, it was an unspoken summons to a stage built for reckoning. Her silence, her years of absence, her unannounced success, all of it would find its voice the moment she stepped foot in that hall. The imagery sharpens as she sets the card down on her desk, the invitation illuminated by the faint glow of a desk lamp. She doesn't smile, she doesn't cry, she simply stares at it, her mind calculating, her heart steady. They wanted me absent when I had nothing, but now they need me present because I own everything, her voiceover declares. The chapter closes with Isabella slipping the invitation into her drawer, her decision unspoken yet inevitable. The stage was set, and for the first time in years, she would walk into a family gathering not as their burden, but as their judge. Chapter 9 unfolds with the sun rising over the grand estate where the wedding is set to take place. The camera lingers on the details. Florists arranging fresh roses, guests in fine attire stepping out of sleek cars, and the chatter of anticipation filling the air. Everything seems perfect until Isabella arrives, dressed in a sharp, understated gown that radiates authority rather than extravagance. She steps out of her black car, heels clicking against the pavement with deliberate rhythm. The silence that follows her entrance is deafening. Inside the venue, her family is already present. They laugh, pose for photos, and exchange warm greetings, unaware that the true orchestrator of this day has just walked through the door. Isabella pauses in the grand hallway, her gaze sweeping over the chandeliers she had chosen, the marble floors she had paid for, the staff who nod at her with quiet respect. Every corner of the venue bears her mark, though none of the guests know it yet. The narrator's voice hardens. They thought this hall was theirs. They thought I would remain a ghost at the edge of their story, but ghosts don't own kingdoms. I do. As she approaches the reception area, eyes begin to shift toward her. Whispers ripple among the guests. Some recognize her instantly, the estranged daughter, the one who had been left out, written off. Others see only a striking woman moving with absolute confidence, unaware of the storm building in her wake. The camera captures her family's first reaction in a slow-motion sequence, her mother's smile faltering, her father's jaw tightening, her siblings exchanging uneasy glances. The bride, resplendent in lace, narrows her eyes, half in shock, half in fury. Isabella takes her seat without permission, without apology. The chapter closes on a sharp beat. The master of ceremonies steps onto the stage to welcome the guests. But before he can begin, the venue manager leans into his ear, whispering something that makes his face pale. His eyes dart toward Isabella, seated calmly, a faint, knowing smirk playing at her lips. The cliffhanger line. That was the moment they realized the hall they celebrated in didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. There's a moment that comes when you look back at the path you've walked and realize how far you've traveled from the place you began. For me, that place was filled with voices that told me I was useless, unworthy, and destined for nothing. I can still hear the echo of those words sometimes, but now they no longer cut me. They remind me of the strength it took to rise above them. As I sit here today, surrounded by the life I built, I can finally reflect without bitterness. My story was born in pain, yes, but it didn't end there. It carried me through struggle, through defiance, through triumph. Every sleepless night, every silent tear, every doubt I carried, it was all part of the fire that forged me. They wished I disappeared, but instead, I shined brighter than they could have ever imagined. I used to think revenge was about proving them wrong, about showing them they had underestimated me. And in some ways, it was. But with time, I came to see that the truest revenge wasn't their recognition or their regret. It was my freedom. Freedom from their voices. Freedom from the cage they tried to keep me in. Freedom to write my own story without ever needing their approval again. I didn't just build a company. I built a life of meaning. I turned my pain into purpose so that others wouldn't have to walk the same lonely road I did. I became the person I needed when I was young, when I was desperate for someone to believe in me. And in doing so, I discovered a truth that will stay with me forever. The deepest wounds can give birth to the brightest light. Sometimes people ask me if I ever wish things had been different. If I had grown up in a home where love was unconditional, where my parents had believed in me from the start. And yes, part of me wonders who I might have been if I had been nurtured instead of torn down. But then I think of the strength I found, the fire that kept me alive, and the legacy I've begun to leave behind. Without those trials, without that pain, maybe I wouldn't be here today. Maybe I wouldn't have had the drive to fight, to rise, to shine. In the end, the past is not something I carry like a burden anymore. It's something I've transformed into fuel. It no longer defines me. It propels me. I don't live in the shadows of what they said about me. I live in the light of what I became despite it. To anyone listening who has ever been told they're not enough, who has ever been pushed aside or made to feel invisible, I want you to remember this. You are not their words. You are not their doubts. You are not their rejection. You are the story you choose to write for yourself, and no one, not even those closest to you, can take that away unless you let them. My parents wanted me to be silent. They wanted me small. They wanted me gone. Instead, I became a voice, a presence, a light that even they could not extinguish. And if there's one lesson my journey has taught me, it's this. Sometimes the very people who wish you disappeared are the ones who unknowingly push you toward becoming unforgettable. This is my story, not of disappearance, but of emergence, not of defeat, but of defiance, not of silence, but of shining. And as I close this chapter, I know my journey doesn't end here. The light I found isn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone who's been told to disappear and chose instead to shine. Because in the end, the greatest victory is not revenge, not recognition, not even success. The greatest victory is becoming unstoppable.